Hello and welcome into episode 51 of the Stomp the Bus show. I am your host, Mark Harris, alongside my co-host, Colton Dodgson. And we have a special guest for this episode, State Press reporter Alex Wakefield, joining the show to talk about all things ASU football in such a transient time in ASU football's history. Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here with you guys.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in ASU football land.
Yeah.
New quarterback, new conference, just all sorts of big events. What's kind of the thing that stood out to you about ASU football right as kind of we're entering the season?
Well, I mean, I think right now you got to start with the fact that Jaden Rashada is going to be under center. I mean, he's only the second true freshman to ever start, for ASU. And after everything that he's been through and after what's been, seems like a really not a competitive and intense quarterback battle. Ultimately it's Rashada, the guy with all the national attention, who is going to be starting, and I think that means there's going to be a lot of eyes on ASU football early on, maybe a bit earlier on than people might have expected this year.
Definitely. That's something Mark and I talked quite a bit about, especially when obviously the national attention surrounding ASU, primarily with Rashada and all the NIL stuff that happened. But we were both kind of under the impression that the microscope wouldn't necessarily be on Rashada on the field for quite some time. I know we had Ralph Amsden on a couple weeks ago, and we were all under the impression after that conversation that it might be Bourget under center starting week one. And it seems like I was shocked when I saw that Rashada was going to get the nod. So what I'm wondering is when do you feel like that started to shift a little bit? It feels like Rashada's rise has happened pretty quickly. When did you see that start to shift a little bit?
Well, I'm guessing it was probably related to the Drew Pine injury. I mean, he seemed to be as much in the driver's seat as anybody else in the competition. And so I think, that made things a little bit clearer. And I think an indicator of that is that Dillingham has said that they'll reevaluate after the Southern Utah game, which will line up with the possibility that Pine could be back. But also, I mean, you go back to spring, and as far as being the starter, Rashada was kind of an afterthought. And so it's been this steady rise over time, starting to take more second team reps. And then he was a Camp T and voted a captain. And, we've started to see, his on field star rise a little bit. And then, obviously it's been meteoric in the last few weeks, and, he's going to start.
Yeah, it's such a great point with how in spring and entering fall camp, he was, I don't want to say an afterthought because that wasn't the case, but he, like, no one was predicting him to be the starter.
Yeah,
It was
right.
very much to like, oh, he'll improve as the season goes along. Um, and now, I mean, obviously Drew Pine's injury opened the door, but I think to me the thing that's just so impressive is how quickly he kind of closed the gap with Bourget. And clearly that means I mean, like, look, I haven't been at practice or anything, but like just by reading the tea leaves, it means that he's cutting down on the kind of freshman mistakes or the errors that Bourget, doesn't make, because how else would he be in that position anyway? So.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
and
I think.
ultimately,
Oh,
go for
sorry.
it.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, ultimately, I think we're still going to see, a fair amount of true freshman errors
Oh,
and
yeah.
some rustiness. But I think this is ultimately a really, really smart and savvy call from Dillingham, because I think the clock for retaining Rashada long term after this year started the moment he walked on campus. And so not only do you give him the opportunity to start and feel like this is a program that's willing to invest in him long term, but also, if he does end up somewhere else ultimately in his career, him starting now, we're getting some of Jaden Rashada, when
Yeah.
in another world with a different starting quarterback, maybe, his talents don't get utilized at ASU as much.
Yeah, it's a great point, Alex, because in this era of the transfer portal and everything like that. The second somebody like Jaden Rashada commits to ASU, your next thought is, okay, how long is he going to be here, right? So it's an interesting layer to this whole thing. And a guy like Kenny Dillingham, who's had the track record with quarterbacks that he's had in recent years, and him making that commitment to a guy like Rashada, I don't know, if to me it kind of feels like that bond being strengthened a little bit. Maybe that's just wishful thinking, but it's really cool to see somebody like Dillingham, the youngest coach in Division I and all of that stuff, make this commitment to a guy, a true freshman. I think that's really cool to see.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Hopefully the line can protect him and give him the opportunity to make some plays.
Yeah, that's probably the weakest roster group on ASU right now, it seems like. So his escapability will definitely come into play. It's interesting. I wonder if you're Elijah Badger or if you're one of the other, new wide receivers, Guillory, Jordan Tyson. I wonder, if you're happier that Rashada has the starting job, or you're happier if Bourget has the starting job. Because with Rashada, you may be more likely to catch like a 50-yard touchdown, but he may also be more likely to miss you when you're open in the flat, whereas Bourget, he's going to hit you. I feel like it's just interesting to be in their shoes in this, but I guess, there's quarterback battles all the time at all schools. So I guess that's just kind of how it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope we get to see a little bit of, and odds are we probably will in the Southern Utah game, see a little bit of, not Drew Pine necessarily, but Trenton Bourget, and see what different quarterbacks bring to the table, because all of the hype around Rashada has been his ability to throw the deep ball, and the element that he brings to the offense in that regard, and taking the top off the defense and everything like that. So it'll be interesting to see what the different quarterbacks bring in that game. Assuming we see them both, hopefully we will.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah,
that would be good. But I expected maybe we would see another quarterback in that Eastern Michigan game too, and we know how that turned out. So,
Man. The game that must not be mentioned.
Yeah, I feel like every episode of this show, though, Mark, we find a way to slide some sort of reference to that game into an episode. You know what I'm saying?
It did change the course of ASU football history. Alex, were you at that game? It was ridiculous. Just the way we were getting run on, and just everything in the background of it.
Yeah, I was not at that game,
Okay.
but I was hearing from everybody I knew who was at that game, I was hearing of just the strange feeling and atmosphere that the people that were there felt, and then
That's a
obviously
good word. Yeah. It was unique. So with Rashada starting, just looking at the ASU football, the schedule this upcoming season, how do you think this team is going to kind of be this year, for lack of a better phrasing?
No, it's a lot of firsts, obviously with Rashada, and then, it kind of feels like Dillingham's been around for a while at this point, because we've all been talking about it and thinking about him for so long. But, he's going to coach his first game as a head coach, as the youngest head coach, next week. And so it's certainly, I think that there's going to be a lot of growing pains. And I think that there could be some ugly results early on. I think about Oklahoma State coming in week 2. I think about USC.
Oh,
in
yeah.
Week 4. There's the opportunity for, some games where a lot of players and a lot of people they're going to learn a lot,
Right.
And so, but ultimately, I think, you look at the past few years, almost every year ASU gets somebody in Tempe. And so, you had Washington last year, you had Washington several years ago, you've had Oregon, et cetera, Michigan State, somebody in Tempe comes in and isn't ready, and ASU tends to get somebody. So I think, there's certainly the possibility that, once things have started to come together and the guys get to know each other a little bit better and understand the system and the coaching staff, that ASU could surprise some people and get some national attention in that way. But it's going to be rough at first, I think, in some of those big time games they've got early on.
Definitely. And the one thing that Mark and I have talked about quite a bit too, and I wanted to see if you maybe agree with this. ASU isn't necessarily, I don't think this offense is going to, ASU won't lose games because their offense can't score points. It's going to be more of a team centered around being on the wrong side of a shootout, right? Something like that. So at the very least, in that regard, we're kind of under the impression that this might be a pretty fun team to watch if you might be a fan of taking an over in a late Pac-12 game or something like that. Is that kind of the impression that you get as well? Is this is at the very least going to be a fun offensive team to watch?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's Arizona State, and it's Kenny Dillingham, and
Yeah.
now it's Jaden Rashada. There's going to be excitement. There's going to be big plays. There's going to be risks. I think that even in the games where, they might be, I don't want to say outclassed, but where they're still figuring things out early on against, really strong teams that have well-established programs and coaching staffs, I think there's still going to be really exciting stuff to watch. And, and that's kind of how Arizona State has managed to be a lot of the time. It's part of the vibe of the program. And it's certainly, something that you would expect out of a Kenny Dillingham run team. So I definitely think they're always going to be worth tuning into. And yeah, it's another classic Pac-12 after dark team, but it's, I do think that, like we talked about, if you don't have strength and size on the line at a Power 5 elite level, there are going to be games where you're going to struggle. And I do think that we will see that, and that the youth of the team and the coaching staff will be seen at times early on, but it's going to be extremely exciting. And I think that it's a team that you'll see improvement as the season goes on, for sure.
Yeah, and they have the personnel. I mean, I mentioned the receivers earlier, but you have Badger, Jordan Tyson from Colorado. Guillory has been looked good at practice. Then you have Conyers. Like, there's just a bunch of guys that Dillingham can get the ball in their hands, and it's a good option, And so I think that gives you a chance in a lot of games, because guys can just make plays, and it's a touchdown drive when otherwise wouldn't have been. And just look, for the ASU fan base, I think it's better to have a team that if they go 6-6, they do it as an offensive team as opposed to being Iowa football, and just having those guys on the outside, I think that just adds just a fun element to this team, even if there's inevitably going to be growing pains.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, but it's Kenny, it's going to be exciting. It's going to be worth watching, and we're going to know after every game exactly how Kenny feels about what happened. So we're going to take that journey along with him. But no, they're going to be great to watch. It's ASU, it's Kenny, and I'm excited. It's I do think there will be growing pains, but that's what it comes down to with a young coach and a young quarterback. That's inevitable.
No, you were so right about he's not going to be able to hide his emotions, because he is he very much wears his emotions on his sleeve, and it's kind of refreshing, but you also in the back of your head be man, maybe there's a reason why college coaches are so wooden all the time. It's easy. It might be better to be that way, but
yeah, and he'll learn that, but we gotta take advantage of being able to here's a little bit more candidness out of the coach while we can. So
yeah,
Definitely. Herm was like that a little bit, which I mean, obviously, it's best to just turn the page on that era. But maybe Kenny will be a little more outspoken for longer than we think. That would be cool, because it is refreshing to see a guy that'll actually talk to the media and tell you what he's thinking, as opposed to the classic coach speak that's so prevalent. But switching gears a little bit, because I know that you have been have covered ASU through this whole shift of conferences and everything like that. And especially at the tail end, because I remember Mark and I recorded an episode the Thursday night before ASU eventually made the move. And that morning was when Oregon and Washington, who were rumored to be already in the Big Ten, were kind of second guessing it a little bit. Could you take us through your perspective on covering that whole move, especially at the tail end? Because we know Michael Crow was somebody who really went in kicking and screaming to an extent, for lack of a better way to phrase that. But can you walk us through what it was like from your perspective, that last end when they were trying to push this over the goal line?
Yeah, well, that was certainly a wild 48 hours in college sports. And, you know, the college sports landscape fundamentally changed overnight, basically. Well, it seemed like there for a second things were going to stay the same, but we ultimately see the first in what I think will ultimately end up being a series of like massive fundamental changes to college sports that, in the next 10 to 15 years, we'll start to get a more solidified idea of what everything will look like. But yeah, I mean, it does seem to be the case that Crow did everything he could to preserve the Pac-12. And, you can look at it one way where, the Pac-12, it's been around in some form since, 1915. And it's, the conference that we all grew up watching, that ASU's been in for decades. And so you can understand why Crow would have, a vested interest in keeping that around. But at the same time, it also became clear that there were things that the other university presidents were starting to see about the college sports landscape, about the realities of what college sports is becoming, that Crow was not on the same page with and was not seeing. And I think ultimately that was a part of why we thought for a moment there on Friday morning that the Pac-9 was going to stay together and possibly add some schools, because, U of A and Utah had already applied to the Big 12. There's reporting to indicate that application had happened and that the Big 12 presidents had agreed to take them if, the trigger was pulled. But it sounds like Crow at that Board of Regents meeting on Thursday evening, that, was immediately close to the public the moment it started.
Right.
Crow, made it clear that there was an interest in trying to keep the Pac-12 alive, and, putting the Oregon and Washington stuff on top of that. For a moment there, it did seem like the Pac-12 is going to survive. But then, Oregon and Washington, as Crow said, no-showed to the meeting where they were going to sign the grant of rights and the media rights deal, and that was that.
Yeah, I mean, that was just a wild, because I went to bed that Thursday night being like, okay, like Michael Crow, like he clearly doesn't want to do this, but whatever, like he just kind of has to, because Oregon and Washington aren't, they're leaving. And then the morning it's like, oh, it's not going to happen. But then it's like, oh, it is going to happen. And it's like, Michael Crow had nowhere else to go. He had to. And the whole time, honestly, one of the things that I'm thinking is like, man, ASU athletics is just so lucky that you're at ASU. Like you're at a giant school. You're in the Phoenix media market. Like all of these like non-actual athletic things we have in our benefit. And if you're Wazoo and you're Oregon State, you've been better on the football field, the last 2 years at least. And you just kind of have everything together more in that sense, but it doesn't matter just because of your market. And it's just like, man, like, because just honestly, like Crow did not lead ASU through this transition well at all. He just flat out didn't. And like, we're just lucky that lucky's not the right phrase, because we do have the media market. We do have the alumni, the whatever, the enrollment, all that. but ASU was fortunate that had those things to kind of lean back on to get a full share from the Big 12, despite this whole time. Like, I didn't, ASU, like, they had made zero indication of, oh, we're going to the Big 12. Like, at every turn, they were like, oh, we're not going. This is not happening. And then they go just because they have the, other tangential stuff. And it's just like, man, like, it's weird that we enter this conference. Like, I think Stuart Mandel did a tweet about it. Like, almost every time a team joins a conference, it's like described as like awesome news for that school. But with ASU, it's like they're only in the conference because they have to be, at least from the upper levels. It's just it's so weird how it all went down.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point about how ASU was kind of getting carried by, the fact that it was in Phoenix and that it has the market size there. Because, I spoke to Crow in March, and he made it clear that they had not had discussions with the Big 12 and that they were invested fully in the Pac-12, which is, the party line, and it's something that the other presidents had indicated, but he had the strongest language at that point.
Yes.
And we've known, this whole situation, at least ASU's role in it, has been, in the works for a decade or more, because Crow has, made it clear where his priorities are at the university and also within the athletic department. And, I've had people tell me, the one thing that really is important to him is that, we have, the opportunity to compete against Stanford and Cal Berkeley in Olympic sports that, other sports don't have. And the investments, which, to their credit, investments in women's sports and in Olympic, non-revenue sports. And that's really important. But I think that there's a disconnect where you see across the country in schools that have invested into their football program and to a lesser extent into their basketball program, into facilities, but also, developing, within NCAA regulations, a strong NIL program and stuff like that. And those schools that do that, you got to spend money to make money. And for every dollar you put into football, you're getting a lot more than a dollar back, which is not the case with most other sports. And so if you want to, have a strong football program that media companies want to pay your conference money to show on television, if you want to create, a sustainable winning program that's exciting, and you have everything around you that you need. You're in Phoenix. You've got the Pac-12 After Dark vibe. You had Herm Edwards, which was an interesting story and national attention. Like, you have all the conditions there, but I think that there was a lot to be learned and a lot that may have been learned about the importance of football and investment in football to, the strength and the position of your athletic department. And, maybe with a brand, Phoenix became the largest media market in the Pac-12, or, you got the Bay Area, but, they're not in San Francisco. It's
well, and nobody cares about either of those schools.
Yeah.
Either.
Like you had the opportunity.
We can complain about ASU's fan base, and there's a lot to complain about, but it's not even close to like Cal and Stanford anyway. But yeah.
And that's why they've been left behind when, they
are. Maybe they might go to the ACC.
Well, yeah, we'll see. I mean, Stanford can pay to get wherever they want if they want to. But yeah, I think that Crow learned a lot, and Anderson and everybody learned a lot about the importance of investment in football. And I think that there's a chance that we see the back end of that where there's more investment, and they're going to get more TV money than they had before from the Big 12. So we'll see if that ends up materializing.
Yeah, it's just I had a point that I was going to make that popped up in my head as you were talking, but it's this whole, here's what it is. It's like the thing with the Pac-12 is like, it's all these people who university presidents, and the problem is like all of these schools, including ASU, have way too big of a version of themselves in their head. But and maybe it is true about the research money that UW does or whatever, but like it doesn't matter in terms of sports context. And so you have all these people, you have all these non-sports people making huge sports decisions. And I mean, if you look at some of the reporting that's come out, it's like they don't know what they haven't, like they don't know what they were doing with that when they asked ESPN for $50 million a school. And it's it's just
Yeah.
yeah, it's just so much that's like, and I mean, honestly, like, I feel like Michael Crow was the ringleader in a lot of this. I mean, especially when you have quotes, he has quoted in like 2019 being like, oh, Larry Scott's a good commissioner. People will be wondering why the Pac-12 surpassed us and all this. And it's like, man, yeah.
Yeah, and you contrast it with the Big 12, which does not have, schools with similar endowment size as some of the Pac-12 schools. They don't have, the research investment, the academic strength of some of the Pac-12 programs, but they had university presidents who hired a commissioner who knew how to meet the moment and empowered their commissioner to go and take risks because they understood that their survival was at stake.
Yep.
Which is something that I don't think many of the Pac-12 presidents, I think Oregon State and Washington State knew it, but I don't think many of the other Pac-12 presidents were tuned into that. And, here we are, where, the Pac-12 blew a 3-1 lead on the Big 12. They had it, and now we're in a world where ASU's in the Big 12, and the Big 12 is, 16 teams and might grow some more, and they're going to survive, and the Pac-12 didn't.
Yeah. Colton, were you going to say something?
I keep thinking about every time we discuss the Big 12, I just think of the basketball element of this and how insane this conference is going to be. They created a basketball super conference, and it's like I imagine the best year ASU is going to have basketball wise. And sorry to just like, this was not an elegant segue at all. It's just kind of like I'm always like, the best that we are going to do basketball wise for a very long time is like barely get out of the bottom 4 of this conference. So it is crazy looking at all of the teams that we're going to be competing against in a basketball sense, and how that's going to work out. But in terms of the future of the teams left, I know you mentioned Washington State and Oregon State as the teams that were like, we're going to be left out if this goes south. And for all intents and purposes, they have been. What do you think the future looks like for do you have any idea of what the future might look like for the schools that have sort of been left behind? I know we've heard rumblings of Stanford and Cal to the ACC and things like that. The one thing we haven't heard too much about, or at least maybe I haven't heard too much about, is Oregon State and Washington State, because I feel like they took the biggest L, so to speak, in everything that's happened so far.
Yeah, so just from the reporting we've seen pretty much over the last day, it would seem that the ACC, had cooled on the idea of adding Stanford and Cal. I don't think that Oregon State and Washington State are being considered by the ACC, but I think that there has been a rejuvenation in those talks as some of the reporting, and that there's a chance that Cal and Stanford, as well as SMU, who was a school that was targeted by the Pac-12 for a while.
And they're just going to pay their way. They're just not going to take any media rights money, which is insane, but also a huge flex, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got the boosters, if you got, the folks who are willing to buy your way into a conference, like, this is the world that we live in, and you can understand from their perspective why that money might be worth it, because you look at the 5 and some of the non-SEC Big Ten teams are starting to, wonder what's going on with that. Think about if you're a group of 5 team, and you have the opportunity to buy your way into a major conference, like you do it if you can. So it sounds like there's a chance that Cal, Stanford, and SMU could end up in the ACC, and that Stanford in particular is really looking for that invitation. But on the Oregon State and Washington State front, I saw a report today that the Mountain West commissioner made a presentation to Washington State, basically courting them into what would be a Mountain West expansion, and that they were planning to make a presentation to Oregon State as well. And I think from a culture and on-field court product standpoint, that Oregon State and Washington State are great fits for the Mountain West. They're honestly, their athletic budgets, are at times a little bit closer to the Mountain West than they were the Pac-12 anyway. And I think that just their play style in, football, for example, Washington State, fast team, always likes to put up a lot of points. Like, there's a lot of that in the Mountain West as well. And the geographic fit is pretty, pretty clear. So though we'll know probably very soon what the results of all of that will be. And I think that, although Oregon State and Washington State in a perfect world would probably want to maintain their Power 5 status, there are going to be losers in this process of consolidation. And unfortunately, I think the writing was on the wall a while ago that Oregon State and Washington State were in danger. But, the Mountain West is cool. I think the Mountain West is cool. And, you're taking a pretty substantial media rights hit, which I understand that can be a huge problem in a lot of ways. But for the consumer and for the fans, I think that this is an interesting opportunity for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you get to go to Honolulu too. I'm watching Hawaii football every Saturday at 11 p.m. So works for me.
And you get to go to Laramie in late November.
I guess there's pros and cons. We'll call it pros.
Two iconic destinations.
Yeah. No, I love the Mountain West. I love watching Mountain West games. There's always something on late, including Hawaii, which Colton and Hawaii have watched many late Hawaii games on a Saturday night. And you're so right. It's tough because they're just taking so much of a hit in terms of media rights distribution that people are going to lose their jobs and stuff. They just can't support as many staffers. But just, you're right, from an on-field standpoint, I would rather be a Wazoo fan or Oregon State fan right now today than a Cal or Stanford fan, because sure, you get to go to the ACC, but you can't go to unless you already live on the East Coast, you can't go to any of the games. You don't have any sort of relationship with any of the teams. Your football teams are going to get are already in a bad spot already, and they're probably just going to get blown out each week because they have to go to the East Coast every single game. If you're Oregon State, sure, it's going to be weird playing San Jose State and I don't know, UNLV or some of these cruddier Mountain West teams, but
New Mexico,
Boise State, you bring in Boise State, you bring in Fresno State, you bring in who's been Air Force has been good, San Diego State, you bring in those teams, and those are legit matchups. And the Mountain West will be the fifth best conference too. That's the other thing, especially if Jonathan Smith stays. But it's funny, throughout this, even though despite ASU did not want to leave at all, it kind of ended up in a kind of a beneficial spot from a relative perspective based on travel in the Big 12. Because sure, you have to go to Morgantown, or Cincinnati or Orlando, but all the other trips are fairly reasonable. It's in Texas, Kansas, still Utah. It's kind of funny how it just despite just totally not playing this well at all and not even kind of seeing the writing on the wall, ASU just ends up in a conference that actually isn't the worst fit, while all the other schools in the Pac-12 basically have to go to the East Coast or they are in the Mountain West.
Yeah, it's definitely a service to the non-football athletes at ASU that they are in the Big 12 and not, for example, the ACC or even the Big 10. And I think, and people have talked about this at length, but it's worth mentioning that the biggest losers in all of this truly are, the non-revenue sport athletes at schools like Oregon and Washington and USC and UCLA that, football can take it. They travel on the weekends, 6-7 times a year.
Charter.
Yeah. It's the volleyball and the swimming and the sports that have, more irregular travel schedules, and where, maybe, those athletes are not as likely to receive big time NIL deals. And so it's a bigger deal that they're missing a lot of class. It's just tragic. And it's something that I wonder if the people who are pulling the strings and making a lot of this happen, if they took into account, if those athletes, the thoughts and feelings of those athletes. I don't think so, because I think that media companies and, football oriented athletic departments are driving all of this.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, you mentioned, I'm excited for Big 12 baseball. I think that'll be fun. And I mean, Big 12 basketball, like it's going to be really interesting. I wonder if it changed recruiting for Hurley. I don't think it will, because like he kind of recruits nationally already.
Congrats, Bobby Hurley, on your contract extension. Now you got to go to Lawrence, every year and play Kansas and play Big 12 basketball. They were in Europe and traveling and having a wonderful time, and all of a sudden they come back and they're in the Big 12, and it's a completely different basketball situation. Obviously, it's
but Alex, at least their arena is serviceable, right?
Entirely functional is the
entirely functional. There it is. Okay.
Oh man, what was your reaction?
You're kind of an honored guest on this show, because we mention that quote probably once an episode whenever we get to anything basketball. So we're gonna have to ask you about that at some point. But Mark, what were you gonna say?
Oh, I was just gonna ask him what was your reaction when he said, "Oh yeah, the arena is functional." Like,
yeah, so that,
I mean, obviously
that
you
meeting,
can't be super reactive when you're with him, but like in your head.
Yeah, and that meeting was really interesting. I was not the only one there, and at one point he was asked a question about AI, and he asked his AI bot on his phone to, I think it was to define intersectional feminism, and we sat there and listened to it define that. I think it was in an Australian accent. He is a very charismatic guy and a great interview. But yeah, it was really fascinating, in particular, to hear him pretty specifically contradict what Ray Anderson, the athletic director, said on the record about, because the way I presented it was, this is what Ray Anderson said, that the arena was in dire need of renovations, which is something he has said, I believe, on, it was Gambo's podcast with Arizona Sports.
One of the Arizona Sports,
yeah. And, he basically said, like, I don't think it's in dire need, and, kind of emphasized that word. And I think that, that's two different perspectives on within the highest levels of ASU athletics as to what, is important moving forward about the basketball stadium. But what I can say is what everybody already knows, which is it is in dire need of renovations. It was not a Pac-12 level. It is certainly not at a Big 12 standard for a basketball facility. If you just, take the median Big 12 basketball facility. And so if you're going to host, Kansas and Kansas State and West Virginia and these, historically strong basketball schools in the Big 12, I think that it's worth continuing to ask the question whether that arena deserves renovations. But yeah, that was certainly kind of a moment where you perk up and when he kind of pretty squarely contradicts what Ray Anderson had said.
Yeah, that's an added aspect to it that I kind of forgot about. I mean, like, I like Desert Financial Arena, but it's like I like it as a fan, like I don't have I obviously understand it needs to be at least renovated or something, but it feels like Michael Crow wanted just the Coyotes thing to pass, and then so he could just be like, oh, you guys can just play basketball over there. But now either something has to be done now, because there's not going to be a new arena coming to town.
Yeah, and we asked about that, and he volunteered. We didn't ask specifically if that were to pass and be built, would you put the basketball teams in there? But he did say, people have said like, oh, you're going to put the basketball teams in the Coyotes arena if it passes. That's not necessarily the case. So he did, address that. But I do think that there were a lot of people at a lot of levels of involvement, that thought that there was a pretty strong chance that if that were to pass and be constructed, but that would have been several years in the future anyway. So Who knows if they would have, decided to do some changes to the existing arena in the meantime. But yeah, it's certainly something to watch, because I don't think that is going to go away. It's going to continue to be their arena, and they're going to keep playing basketball games in it. And now they're going to host Big 12 schools in it. So
yeah, it's going to continue to deteriorate too, just as the time goes on.
Going to keep getting older, right?
Yeah.
I think there's such an interesting element in terms of basketball recruiting too, and Bobby Hurley has done such a good job at it, especially in this transfer era, of kind of retooling his roster every year. But when you're recruiting in the Big 12, so to speak, and you're bringing in these guys and trying to compete with Kansas and Baylor and all of these other schools that are going to be in your conference, that has to heighten the urgency, right? I know you mentioned this isn't going anywhere, but that element of this whole issue is only going to, it has to make this more of a priority. Is that kind of how you feel a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, like it's behind the standards of the Pac-12 arenas right now, and I think that problem probably exacerbates if you move to the Big 12, when you move to the Big 12. So I certainly think it will be on the lower end as far as stadium facility quality of the Big 12. Now, the people who make those decisions have to determine whether that's a priority and whether that's something worth addressing ultimately. But I do think that it's pretty clear that it's behind on that aspect.
Yeah,
we're definitely in agreement on that. I love going to the games and sitting in sections where there's 4 other people in the section and everything. That's all great. But I don't think you sell recruits on that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, totally. Well, as we kind of wrap this up, just curious, like going to the Big 12, there's so much newness to it. Like there's so much, well, I guess other than like the 3 other schools that are coming along with, but like going to these random schools in Texas and like West Virginia, like what's kind of the rivalry, the potential rivalry that ASU could have that kind of interests you as they move into the Big 12?
I think I love that question, and I'm excited to play BYU. I think from a geography standpoint, from a culture of the fan base, and the culture of the university standpoint, there's a lot of really interesting contrasts, and I think that I think that those 2 fan bases are going to learn to find ways to dislike each other, and I'm looking forward to that in a very healthy rivalry way, of course. But
of course,
of course. But I'm really excited for that. Obviously, it's a joy that the world gets BYU Utah back as a conference game because of all this movement. It's kind of a story that fell under the radar that all of a sudden that's back, and that's a serious rivalry. And so if ASU starts to play BYU and they get some high profile games against each other, I certainly see that. And from a geography standpoint as well, obviously as a really ripe opportunity for a new healthy rivalry for ASU.
That's a great one. I just think back to that BYU game 2 years ago and the intensity in that game, and I can only imagine like what that would be like. And BYU, I feel like flies under the radar sometimes. So the second you mentioned that, I'm like, oh yeah, that would be wild. That's a good one.
And there's a lot of BYU fans in the Valley. So
yeah, for sure.
That's what really makes it interesting.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm really excited.
No, like everyone's saying, oh, it's going to be like ASU West Virginia is going to be a big rivalry, and I'm like, because of a dumb joke made by our AD, like we're going to play them once every 3 years. Like I don't think like maybe the first game there will be some buzz around it, but it'll just fade away after that. But like BYU definitely, and I think Texas Tech could be
Mm,
a great rivalry for us. I think there's a lot of similarities between the schools. You have some. I mean, they were in the conference, the border conference way back when, and there's the recent, game against Mahomes at Sun Devil Stadium. That game,
Classic.
yeah, the Kalen Balaj game. But
yeah.
it's it's weird because with the Big 12, you don't have like the USC's or Washington's or Oregon's, but you also don't have like a Stanford or Cal where like nobody cares either. So it's a nice mix.
No, I completely agree. And I 100% agree on the parallels between Texas Tech and ASU, especially in, their football and basketball, play style and kind of just vibe and role within the conference. I think that's a really good one. That'll be a fun one to watch for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. I have one more question. I'm going to ask everyone. Colton and I probably won't record next week just since the Southern Utah game is on a Thursday. So this will be our last show until then. With that in mind, let's give a score prediction for Southern Utah and a season record prediction for ASU. I'll start off. I think ASU wins 48-16. I think the defense will allow Southern Utah will get some yards, but they'll settle for a few field goals, and then ASU pulls away. Season record prediction, I'm gonna go 6-6. I'll say 6-6. I think they can squeak into a bowl game. It's gonna be a weird way that they get there, but I'll be optimistic, I guess, and go 6-6. How about Colton? Let's go with you, and then finish off with Alex.
All right, score prediction. This is so tough. I don't know if somebody gets this right, it'll be like unreal. I'm asking for all their gambling plays if they get this right, but I feel like 38-10 is what I'm going with ASU obviously winning this game. I could see scratch that. I'm going 38-13. Let's go 38-13
Okay.
ASU. And then season prediction. When Alex mentioned earlier that there's always a team that comes to Sun Devil Stadium and late in the season, and there's always some like classic surrounding that game. I'm seeing this Oregon game staring at me on November 18th, and I feel like I like your 6-6 prediction, and that's what I'm going to go with. And I think they're going to beat Oregon in that game to get to 6. They'll be at, let's say, I'm trying to do the math on the spot. What would that be? 5-5. They'll win that game.
Entering the game.
No, 4-5. They'll win that game.
Okay.
No. They'll be 4-6 entering that game. They'll beat Oregon, beat U of A. They'll finish at 6-6. There we go. That was painless.
Okay. That would be quite the way to get to 6-6.
Yeah, no, I'm adding some suspense there, I guess.
There we go. All right, Alex, finish this off.
As far as score prediction, I'll go around Colton's vibe. I'll go like 31-6. I think the defense will take it as a point of pride that they don't allow a touchdown in the opening game. As far as season record, I think you guys are a little bit optimistic. I'll go 5-7. I'll go 5-7. I see win opportunities early on. I think Southern Utah and Fresno State are great chances. I see Cal and then Colorado as 2 very winnable games as well. And then I look at the rest of the schedule, and I think that getting one of those games would be a success because it's an extremely difficult schedule down the stretch. So, and I expect them to, like we talked about, maybe win one game that they shouldn't, and then, U of A is always a toss-up. They've improved in a lot of ways. So I'll go with 5-7 just to be different from you guys.
I feel that. Hey, you know what? 5-7 covers the season win total. So really, that's all that matters if we're being honest. So, Alex, thanks for hopping on. And, if you're watching the show, please like and subscribe on YouTube, rate and review on your podcast.
Alex, We got to have you on again, man, when the season starts. It was awesome.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Definitely.
anytime.
Yeah, well, I got your email, and yeah, we can talk after ASU beats Colorado by 50 points. That would be that. I am so excited for that Colorado game. Like, no matter what, no matter how the season even goes, like, it might be two awful teams, but there's just going to be so much to come out of that game. Yeah.
I completely agree. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, and as always, go Devils.